The patrol cruiser drifted quietly through the evening traffic of Chicago Arcology Sector 12. Outside, layers of airborne transit lanes moved between shimmering holographic towers, while a sprawling crowd of humans and diverse alien species packed the neon-lit walkways below. Officer Jim Rello rested his elbow lazily against the doorframe, one hand draped over the steering ring, while the autopilot handled the routine patrol route. Beside him, Officer Selvin kept his gaze fixed out the window, his expression a mix of professional vigilance and deep, enduring confusion. 6 years on Earth, and the place still felt like a psychological minefield. Selvin's eyes suddenly locked onto a glowing, archaic neon sign squeezed tightly between a high-end cybernetics clinic and a bustling noodle bar. The Range 702, an exclusive shooting range for pre-FTL Earth firearms. Selvin blinked, his secondary eyelids twitching slightly as he turned to his partner. "Why?" Jim glanced out the window, a slow smirk spreading across his face. "Oh, hey, that place is still kicking." "That is an observation, not an answer," Selvin countered, his brow furrowing deeper. "Jim, I have noticed an alarming number of human civilians still carrying these primitive kinetic weapons. We are a millennium into the modern galactic era. Chemical propellant firearms are absolutely fundamentally obsolete." "Yep," Jim said casually. "Modern energy shields make them entirely useless," Selvin pressed, gesturing emphatically. "Even a basic civilian-grade personal barrier can absorb kinetic impacts effortlessly. No military or law enforcement body in the quadrant uses ballistic weaponry outside of historical archives. Furthermore, they make no economic sense. Modern plasma and laser sidearms run on rechargeable thermal cells, have almost zero recoil, and require almost no maintenance. Meanwhile, these primitive things require physical ammunition, explosive chemical propellants, lots of moving parts and constant cleaning. They are actively more expensive than modern tech. There are barely any manufacturing facilities left producing them at scale. Most survive as hobbyist projects, collector pieces, or historical curiosities. So, why? Jim shrugged, his eyes lazily tracking a passing transit line. "Because humans like them." Selvin stared, his secondary eyelids freezing flat. "That cannot possibly be the full answer." Jim leaned back slightly into the synth leather seat, his tone shifting into something thoroughly relaxed yet unyielding. "History. Habit. Sport. Family stuff. Some people just like the feel of real metal." He reached down, tapping the cruiser's reinforced door panel with a dull, heavy, rhythmic thud. "And some people just don't trust giving up the option." Selvin tilted his head, his auditory frills twitching in confusion. "Option?" Jim's expression didn't yield a single line. The easygoing slouch remained, but his eyes hardened into something ice-cold. "Insurance." "Against what?" Selvin asked, his analytical mind completely missing the cultural weight of the word. Jim looked him dead in the eye. "Tyranny." Selvin frowned. Jim leaned back into the synth leather seat. "Ever hear of the Second Amendment?" Selvin hesitated. "Your ancient constitutional right regarding civilian weapon ownership?" "Bingo." Jim tapped the old steel frame lightly. "Human history taught us something uncomfortable." His voice stayed casual. "Governments fail. Institutions fail. Good people get replaced by bad ones. Humans figured it was smart to keep a last resort reminder that power works both ways." Jim glanced at the seamless composite shell of his standard-issue sidearm on his hip and smirked. "Besides, today's sidearms feel like cheap plastic toys. Too light, too sterile, soulless." Jim pointed toward the cruiser's glove compartment. "Open it up." Selvin complied, pulling the compartment open to find a heavy, dark metal pistol resting snugly inside a faded leather holster. The alien froze, staring at the scuffed frame and worn wooden grips. "Is that?" "Go ahead, pick it up," Jim offered. Selvin lifted the weapon, and his arm dipped a visible 2 inches from the sheer, concentrated mass. "Void above. This is unnecessarily, aggressively heavy. No wonder these are obsolete." "Solid steel frame," Jim said proudly. A Colt M1911 family piece. Been around for about 1,000 years. Selvin blinked. 1,000 years? Jim nodded casually. Far as family records go, one of my ancestors bought it around the time humanity started switching to galactic standard sidearms. Been passed down ever since. Every generation cleaned it, repaired what needed repairing, replaced springs when necessary, took care of it. He gave the slide an affectionate tap. Still works. Selvin stared at the pistol again. The thing suddenly felt different in his hands. His analytical mind was reeling, trying to process the sheer physics of what he was looking. Jim, Selvin said slowly, genuine disbelief creeping into his voice. This weapon is a 1,000-year-old relic, and still functional. Yep, that is... He paused, struggling for words. An extraordinary feat of metallurgy and engineering. Jim shrugged. We're bad at throwing old stuff away. Selvin looked horrified again. A family heirloom weapon that survived a millennium. He looked back at the pistol. You humans are deeply concerning. Jim flashed a grin that instantly made Selvin uneasy as he swung the cruiser into a designated parking lane. Tell you what, lunch break. Let's go inside. Selvin immediately tried to thrust the heavy block of steel back into Jim's hands. Absolutely not. Come on, Jim chuckled, popping his door open. You're a trained law enforcement officer, Selvin. Don't tell me you're scared of a piece of metal. That thing looks entirely too eager to cause bodily harm, Selvin grumbled, though he reluctantly followed his partner out of the car. The absolute second they stepped through the building's front doors, a thunderous boom rattled the glass window panes and vibrated violently through Selvin's boots. Selvin physically flinched, instinctively ducking his head and reaching for his standard-issue plasma cell. What in the cosmic void was that? An explosion? Jim didn't even blink. He just casually strolled toward the front desk. Relax, dude. We haven't even entered the actual range yet. Selvin stared around the lobby in pure horror. No wonder these weapons became obsolete. The lobby itself was crowded with humans and a scattering of alien civilians. A grey-haired man casually cleaned a wooden rifle at a table while drinking coffee. Two young humans argued over ammunition calibers beside a vending machine. A Vectrian woman posed for pictures holding an antique revolver while her human boyfriend laughed. The bored clerk behind the counter didn't even look up as she slid 2 pairs of heavy, padded earmuffs across the desk. Selvin snatched his up and shoved them over his auditory receptors, pulling them dangerously tight. First time? She asked Selvin. Yes, Selvin replied cautiously. Good luck, the clerk said flatly. Selvin blinked. That is not reassuring. They pushed through a set of heavy double doors into the firing range. The place itself felt primitive. Concrete lanes, paper targets. The air was thick and grey, carrying a sharp chemical sting that reminded Selvin vaguely of scorched machinery, hot metal, and something faintly sulphurous. I'll give you a demonstration, Jim said, stepping up to an empty lane. Jim loaded the old Colt M1911 with practiced familiarity. He slid a magazine into the handle and pulled the slide back with a heavy mechanical clack. Jim took a casual, one-handed stance, leveled the iron sights at a paper target downrange and squeezed. Boom! Even through the industrial-grade hearing protection, the sound hit Selvin like a physical punch to the sternum. A brilliant orange flash erupted from the barrel, accompanied by a visible concussive shockwave that rippled the air and kicked the heavy gun violently upward. Jim didn't flinch. He just rode the recoil perfectly, lowered the weapon, and turned to hand it over. His expression was entirely deadpan. Your turn. Selvin stared at the smoking, hot piece of machinery as if it had personally threatened his bloodline. I believe your species has fundamentally misunderstood the concept of recreational activity. Come on, you'll survive, Jim said, his tone flat and unblinking. The alien reluctantly took the pistol. It felt warm, heavy, and radiating an aura of raw, violent intent. nothing like the perfectly balanced, whisper-quiet elegance of his plasma sidearm. Selvin planted his feet, gripped the handle with both hands using maximum hydraulic pressure, and squeezed the trigger. Boom! The ferocious, unmitigated kinetic energy slammed through his arms, violently wrenching his wrists upward and forcing him to stumble backward a full half-step. Selvin's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated shock. Jim finally broke his cold composure, doubling over as a loud chuckle escaped him, while a few human civilians in the neighboring lanes offered amused, knowing grins at the classic alien reaction. Selvin slowly, carefully laid the weapon down on the bench, his fingers visibly trembling as he flexed his aching joints. I now understand why humans evolved such dense, skeletal structures. He flexed his wrist again. So you could survive your own recreational activity. Jim just chuckled again, slapping his partner on the shoulder as he scooped up the pistol. Come on, Selvin. Let's go get some lunch. For over 5,000 years, the Milky Way had known peace. It was not the fragile, anxious quiet born of mutual deterrence, but a profound, fundamental peace, the kind that lasted so long. Civilizations began treating the concept of war as an artifact of primitive history. There had been disputes, of course. Border skirmishes over resource-rich nebulae, minor trade conflicts between corporate cartels, and occasional pirate activity near the ragged outer rims. But true interstellar war, the kind that burned worlds, shattered fleets and choked out stars, had vanished ages ago. Technology had seen to that. Modern shield systems had effectively civilized the art of conflict, turning violence into a matter of predictable mathematics. Planetary defense grids could comfortably intercept relativistic impacts. Fleet barriers absorbed high-output plasma bombardment with clinical efficiency, and infantry-tier shields had rendered primitive kinetic weapons irrelevant. Many centuries earlier, civilization had evolved. Weapons had standardized into clean, low-maintenance energy matrices, and war became something controlled, predictable, and contained. Beyond the rim of the Milky Way, there was nothing. This was not due to a lack of scientific curiosity, but because intergalactic travel remained functionally impossible with the limits of current technology. Where humanity and the rest of the galactic compact could cross the Milky Way in a matter of weeks by riding the dense, interconnected hyperlane networks of the galactic core, the intergalactic void offered no such paths. Stripped of gravitational anchors, standard FTL engines degraded to a crawl. Even with the apex of modern engineering, crossing the empty abyss to Andromeda without an established network would take centuries of uninterrupted blind drifting. So, like all aging civilizations do, the galaxy eventually stopped looking outward. Their reach was firmly bound by the technological limits of the age. There was simply nothing practical out there to find. Then the sky tore open above the Carthan relay. At first, the automated station logs flagged the anomaly as a catastrophic navigation accident, a massive freighter dropping out of warp incorrectly. Then the unknown vessels opened fire. There was no warning broadcast, no attempt at communication, and no demands for territory or surrender. The Carthan Defense Fleet, the pride of the local quadrant, ceased to exist exactly 17 minutes later. When the sensor footage spread across the galactic networks hours later, it triggered an immediate, paralyzing shock. The attacking ships were unlike anything the Milky Way had ever engineered. Black, jagged, angular hulls wrapped in twisting gravitational distortions. Their weapons did not burn or pierce. They fired phase harmonic anomalies that carved through standard-issue shield arrays, as though the defensive barriers weren't even there. Heavily armored cruisers were split clean down the center in single casual strikes. Worst of all, the invaders completely ignored every frantic transmission sent by the Council. By the time the Galactic Council gathered for an emergency session in the high spires of the core worlds, 12 major colony systems had already gone dark. That was the moment panic truly took root, because the impossible realization finally settled over the collective consciousness of the galaxy. They were not alone, and whoever lived in the dark expanse of Andromeda was vastly, terrifyingly beyond them. Historians would later refuse to call the events that followed a war. Massacre was the more accurate term. Fleet after fleet died attempting conventional engagement tactics against the Andromedan vanguard. Nothing the compact possessed could tilt the scales. High-yield plasma batteries dispersed harmlessly across the enemy's shifting gravitational fields. Particle lances bent wildly away from the black hulls, and even heavy antimatter payloads failed to breach Andromedan armor reliably. Meanwhile, the invaders' weapons ripped through modern defenses with casual ease. Planetary shields collapsed in minutes under the strain of unfamiliar physics, and orbital shipyards vanished overnight. Military doctrine refined over thousands of peaceful years suddenly meant less than nothing. The galaxy had spent a millennium optimizing itself for highly civilized, low-casualty warfare. The Andromedans had not. Entire worlds fell within hours of first contact, their defenses systematically dismantled by the relentless momentum of the invasion. There was no halting the onslaught. Across dozens of systems, the black, angular silhouettes simply appeared in the upper atmosphere and reduced planetary grids to ash. Some sectors attempted to fight to the very last ship, though their defiance changed nothing but the final body count. One by one, the great powers of the Milky Way folded beneath the weight of an unprecedented military machine, unable to find a single flaw in the invaders' tactics. And for the first time in 5,000 years, the galaxy remembered what it felt like to fear the dark. The realization that the war against the Andromedans was entirely hopeless did not arrive all at once. It bled across the galaxy long before the black fleets ever reached the outer rims of Sol. Every theater of engagement ended in identical, unmitigated defeat. Entire armadas vanished, attempting to merely slow the invaders' vanguard, and fortress worlds that had stood untouched for millennia fell in mere hours. The great military powers of the Milky Way, the very civilizations that had optimized their existence around civilized mathematical warfare, collapsed one after another. Nothing worked. High-output plasma batteries, sophisticated particle lances, and layers of planetary orbital shield grids were systematically bypassed or torn apart with terrifying ease. Worst of all, the invaders never paused to consolidate their gains. They simply kept advancing without issuing demands, attempting negotiation, or offering occupation treaties. There were only two constants left in the universe: absolute surrender or total annihilation. Eventually, the Galactic Federation accepted the mathematical certainty of their doom. When the emergency declaration was broadcast across every remaining communication network in the Milky Way, the High Ministers of the Council spoke not as rulers, but as fractured survivors. The mandate was clear, hollow, and devastating. Further resistance is assessed as strategically impossible. All member civilizations are advised to initiate immediate surrender protocols to minimize civilian casualties. Submission guarantees species continuity. Resistance guarantees extinction. The broadcast shattered whatever fragile hope remained. One by one, entire worlds folded. Planetary governments lowered their planetary defense grids before the Andromedan silhouettes even entered their upper atmospheres, and proud military fleets powered down their energy matrices to drift silently in the dark, awaiting occupation. Entire civilizations bent the knee without firing a single shot, and in a cold and bitter way, they survived. They were broken, stripped of their sovereignty, and deeply humiliated, but they were alive. Yet the galaxy was not entirely uniform. There remained a handful of stubborn, unyielding species who refused to believe that survival without freedom was survival at all. The Teralis chose to burn their own industrial moons rather than yield their shipyards. The Krovak intentionally detonated the defensive suns inside their home systems, and the Valori fought with desperate, agonizing fury until their very oceans boiled beneath orbital bombardment. It changed nothing. The Andromedans crushed them all with clinical indifference, turning their defiance into little more than a brief, tragic delay between invasion and inevitable extinction. And then, the Black Fleets turned their sights toward Earth. Humanity had received the Federation's order to submit, stand down, and survive, just like every other species in the compact. But those who actually knew humanity, those who had lived alongside them, studied their messy history, or walked the neon-lit corridors of their crowded arcologies, knew with absolute terrifying certainty that they would never surrender. Where the rest of the galaxy saw flawless mathematical logic in capitulation, Earth saw a threat to its soul. In the high courts of the core worlds, distant diplomats dismissed the defiance as primitive pride. Surviving military strategists, watching the Black Fleets close in, called it pure, unadulterated stupidity. But down on the ground, as citizens reached for things hidden in floorboards and glove compartments, people simply called it human. And so, the war finally came home. Humanity's orbital defenses died in under 3 hours. The first Terran defense fleet engaged above Luna and ceased to exist 21 minutes later. The Martian ring batteries, fired until Andromedan lances, cut the planet's defense grid apart piece by piece. Orbital stations burned, shipyards exploded, debris rained through Earth's atmosphere like falling stars. Every military analyst in the galaxy already knew the outcome. Earth would fall like every other world before it. Another stubborn civilization, making one final meaningless stand against the inevitable, and from orbit, that appeared to be exactly what was happening. But while the battle above Earth ended like every other defeat in the war, the story unfolding on the ground was about to change the galaxy forever. Chicago burned beneath a wounded sky. Far above the arcology spires, fragments of shattered orbital stations tore through the upper atmosphere like falling stars, dragging long, angry trails of fire across the crimson clouds, while distant explosions rolled endlessly overhead. Every few seconds, the horizon flashed a blinding clinical white as another planetary defense platform died somewhere in the thermosphere. The sound always arrived moments later, a deep, hollow thunder that rattled windows, cracked the pavement, and reminded everyone still alive that the battle in orbit was already completely lost. Earth had fallen. The people on the ground simply had not accepted it yet. The streets had dissolved into absolute chaos. Sirens screamed from every direction, their wails periodically drowned beneath the grinding roar of collapsing concrete or the engines of emergency transports forcing their way toward the subterranean transit bunkers. Smoke hung thick and greasy between the skyscrapers, turning the afternoon into something dim, suffocating, and orange. Through the haze, frightened civilians pushed desperately through shattered intersections, clutching children, luggage, and emergency medical kits, anything they had managed to grab before the sky began to fall. Humans ran blindly beside species that, only a day earlier, had simply been neighbors. A terrified Talon mother clutched 2 children against her feathered chest. An elderly Vectrian stumbled forward, coughing through the thick soot, while total strangers half-carried him toward shelter, and a massive Groxery civilian used his towering frame to shield smaller evacuees from the raining glass and debris. Nobody cared who belonged to what world anymore. Fear had made everyone equal. "Move!" Jim Rello shouted, his voice raw and scraping from repeating the same command for hours. He stood beside the overturned, smoking remains of their patrol cruiser, waving civilians toward the subway access tunnels, while keeping one shaking hand wrapped around his plasma sidearm. "Keep moving! Don't stop! The bunker entrance is 2 blocks south!" Beside him, Selvin raised his service rifle and fired another frantic burst down the avenue. The blue plasma streaked through the smoke and slammed directly into the chest of the lead Andromedan soldier. The phase shield shimmered a cold, indifferent violet, dispersing the superheated energy into a harmless cascade of static sparks. That was all. The alien did not even slow down. Selvin's stomach dropped as the thing simply kept walking, slow, measured, and entirely certain, like an apex predator approaching prey trapped in a cage. "Damn it," Selvin whispered, his secondary jaw trembling. The Andromedans emerged from the billowing smoke in total silence. They were tall enough to tower over nearly everyone in the street, wrapped in black armor that looked disturbingly organic beneath flickering, blood-red circuitry lines. They moved with the calm confidence of an apex force that had never learned the concept of fear. Their helmets were smooth and completely unreadable, stripped of anything familiar, no eyes, no expressions, no humanity. There was only a cold design built purely for conquest. They did not rush, They did not yell, and they did not posture. They advanced the way a winter storm moved. Inevitable. Behind Jim, someone started crying, a soft, hopeless sound that was instantly swallowed by the wind. Ahead of them, one of the invaders slowly raised a heavy, angular weapon. Jim had seen the recordings from the outer rims. Everyone had. But none of the digital footage prepared him for the physical reality of it. The beam crossed the street in a silent flash of blue-white light. A human civilian standing behind a reinforced concrete barricade disappeared. He didn't fall, and he didn't burn. He was simply gone. 1 second he was standing there, and the next, there was nothing but a drift of grey ash caught in the hot, sweeping wind. The woman beside the empty space screamed so violently her voice broke, and a fresh wave of raw panic tore through the crowd. People shoved wildly against one another. Children cried out into the smoke. Someone fell and was trampled underfoot, while someone else screamed for a son, a daughter, a husband. Jim couldn't even tell the voices apart anymore. And somewhere deep inside himself, beneath the years of police training, the adrenaline and the primal fear, something cold and heavy settled into Jim Rello's chest. For the first time since the invasion began, he understood with absolute certainty that they were going to die here. Jim fired again, his teeth bared against the sting of ozone, but the blue plasma simply splashed harmlessly across the advancing soldier's shield matrix. The energy dispersed into a cold, flickering violet static before fading into absolutely nothing. The invader barely even shifted its momentum. It was a terrifying display of absolute invulnerability. Beside him, Selvin fired disciplined, rhythmic bursts from his own weapon while retreating backward toward the bottleneck of the bunker corridor, his free hand waving the terrified civilians behind them. "Move!" he shouted, his voice cracking through his external comms. "Keep moving!" The crowd stumbled past them in a blind, frantic panic, humans, Talons and Vectrians alike shoving violently toward the narrow underground entrances, while thick, greasy smoke rolled through the shattered streets. Jim glanced over his shoulder, his heart hammering against his ribs. There were still too many people on the street. They were moving too slow. And ahead of them, the Andromedans continued their advance with a dreadful, mechanical patience. There were 5 of them, emerging steadily through the orange haze like silent monuments of obsidian. They weren't rushing. They weren't taking cover. They simply walked forward as standard-issue police plasma bolts splashed uselessly against their armor plating. It was the quiet, terrifying confidence of predators who had never once had a reason to question victory. Selvin checked his rifle's charge indicator. The display flashed a solid, dead red. Empty. His stomach tightened into a hard knot of despair as Jim looked down at his own sidearm. Only 2 shots left in the power cell. That was all. Suddenly, another Andromedan slowly raised its heavy, angular weapon. The incoming phase blast struck a stalled civilian transport near their makeshift barricade, and the front half of the vehicle instantly disappeared in a silent flash of blinding white heat. The remaining metal screamed as the molecular structure fell apart, and the resulting concussive shockwave slammed through the avenue hard enough to throw fleeing bodies sideways onto the asphalt. Panic rippled violently through the remaining crowd. People screamed, children cried out into the smoke, and somewhere in the crush, someone fell. It was a Vectrian civilian, small, thin, her bioluminescent skin pulsing a frantic, terrified grey, hitting the pavement hard near the overturned remains of a transit barrier. The panicked crowd simply surged around her, then past her. In the shadow of annihilation, fear moved much faster than compassion. She tried to push herself up, but her limbs buckled under the weight of her own terror. Jim's stomach dropped. The nearest Andromedan shock trooper noticed her. Slowly, deliberately, the massive warrior broke formation. Its towering frame moved toward the fallen civilian with an unsettling fluid calm, while the others behind it simply stopped, watching and waiting. The Vectrian woman looked up through the ash, and Jim saw the expression in her eyes. Pure, helpless, heartbreaking terror. The invader didn't fire from a distance. It stepped closer. It lowered its weapon slowly, almost as if it were savoring the absolute futility of her existence, wanting her to see the exact shape of what was about to kill her. "No!" both the officers roared. Neither officer thought. Neither calculated the mathematics of survival. They simply moved. Selvin hit the Andromedan first, slamming his entire weight into the creature's armored torso with every ounce of force he could muster, while Jim lunged right beside him to drag the civilian back. The Vectrian woman scrambled free immediately, stumbling away and sobbing hysterically as she fled toward the safety of the bunker entrance. Behind them, the remaining Andromedan squad halted completely. They stood perfectly still, silent, and watching, almost curious, as though they were observing the amusing, meaningless thrashing of insects. The lead invader barely even registered the impact of Selvin's tackle. With casual indifference, one massive three-jointed arm swept outward. Jim felt the crushing impact before his mind could even process the movement. The entire world flipped violently sideways. He slammed into the reinforced frame of the ruined patrol cruiser hard enough to dent the metal, the violent concussive force rattling the vehicle's frame until the latch of the dashboard glove box violently snapped open. Jim crashed down onto the pavement like a broken ragdoll as the air exploded from his lungs, but through the blinding white pain flashing across his cracked ribs, his blurred vision locked onto the open compartment, where the faded leather case had spilled forward, flashing the heavy dark metal slide of the Colt M1911 right in front of his face. A few feet away from Jim, Selvin crashed heavily to the ground, his rifle clattering away into the debris. The Andromedan was on him instantly, pinning him to the asphalt. One heavy, clawed boot pressed down hard against the alien officer's chest, fracturing the underlying polymer plates of his armor, while the black, angular rifle lowered slowly until the barrel was inches from Selvin's face. A low, mechanical hum filled the air as the weapon began to charge, its power cell whining with an ominous rising pitch. Selvin struggled wildly against the crushing weight, but he couldn't move. The blood-red circuit lines glowing beneath the invader's armor reflected directly in his wide, terrified eyes, unhurried, precise, and absolute. Around them, the other Andromedans remained perfectly motionless in the smoke, watching, waiting to see the inevitable end. A thunderous boom shattered the street. It was not the cold hiss of Andromedan energy fire, not the rising shriek of a phase weapon discharging. It was something heavier, sharper, and aggressively violent. A sound that cracked through the rolling smoke and shattered glass like an explosion trapped inside solid metal. For half a heartbeat, Selvin squeezed his eyes shut. Certain this was it. Certain the weapon above him had fired. But his face did not disappear. The ominous humming in the air abruptly stopped, and a heavy ringing silence crashed down into the avenue. Slowly, thoroughly confused, Selvin forced his eyes open. The towering Andromedan was still standing directly over him, its fingers still wrapped around its black rifle. Only now something looked wrong. Very wrong. The alien soldier swayed slightly, its rifle lowering not with purpose but uncertainty. The blood-red circuitry beneath its armor flickered erratically. And there, right through the center of its chest plate, was a hole. It was small, smoking, perfectly punched through armor that had shrugged off plasma fire like rain. For one impossible second, the invader simply stood there, its smooth helmet tilted downward slowly toward the wound, as though trying to understand, as though reality itself had stopped making sense. Then the massive body staggered heavily, its knees buckling as it collapsed face first onto the asphalt. The impact shook a fresh layer of dust loose from the shattered concrete. Dead. An absolute silence spread across the avenue, so sudden and profound that even the distant screaming of the fleeing crowd seemed to pause. The remaining Andromedans did not advance to avenge their fallen. They were uncertain. Selvin saw it immediately in the subtle, tense shifts of their posture. It was real, unadulterated confusion. It wasn't the tactical caution of an experienced vanguard adjusting their strategy. It was the blind panic born when absolute certainty dies. One of the remaining soldiers stepped forward slowly, deliberately, its attention fixed entirely on the fallen warrior. Its rifle lowered, its elongated frame bending slightly as it approached the body, studying the impossible wound in stunned disbelief, as though verifying what its own advanced sensor matrices refused to accept. Another thunderous boom cracked through the smoke. The second Andromedan snapped violently backward, as if struck by an invisible freight train. Its smooth helmet split down the middle under the sheer kinetic force, and the body collapsed heavily beside the first, dead before it even hit the pavement. The remaining 3 invaders froze completely. Across the street, slumped against the warped steel frame of the ruined patrol cruiser, sat Jim Rello. One arm clutched hard against his ribs, while the other held the ancient pistol loosely but steadily in his grip, smoke still curling lazily from the dark metal barrel. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths, ash and firelight flickering across a face that looked just as stunned as everyone else's. For several long seconds, nobody in the entire sector moved. The surviving Andromedans just stared. At Jim, at the primitive piece of metal, and at the dead bodies pooling dark fluid onto the street. Suddenly, something sharp, rapid, and heavily distorted crackled through one of their helmet speakers. The tone was fast, uneven, and entirely wrong. For an empire that had conquered 100 worlds without ever questioning a victory, the voice sounding through the static was something they had never recorded before. It was panic. One of the invaders took a step backward into the haze, then another followed. Then, completely stripping away their flawless military formation and rigid discipline, the 3 remaining Andromedans turned their backs on local law enforcement and disappeared into the smoke, running.